Hi friends, welcome back to another Bible study and welcome back to the How to Read the Bible course. Today we're going to be looking at covenants. More specifically, we're going to be looking at covenant theology versus dispensational theology, mostly because, how do I put this nicely? I wholeheartedly disagree with dispensational theology. When I first started studying my Bible and was taking college classes and trying to find all of these courses online and get my hands on anything I could find, I initially learned from dispensational teachers. So I definitely understand how you got there, and I then have to be a little sympathetic to this party. But now that I've been taught differently, I disagree. And so with that in mind, because you're probably never going to see it on this channel again, do want to kind of give it a little bit of room, because it's not a heresy to abide by dispensational theology, but I do think it can be harmful, especially because dispensational theology tends to be paired with other tricky things that also tend to really cause issues. I don't know if it's just like a correlation situation, because they wouldn't have to feed off of each other in order to exist, but they often do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the eschatology video. But for now, let's talk about it. All right, so first and foremost, what is a covenant? A covenant is, I don't want to say it's like a promise, because it being a covenant implies that it is much more than a promise, right? But it's based on a promise. And by and large, you could, generally speaking, say that a covenant establishes that we are God's people and God is our God. He is our God. That is going to be one of the main things that every covenant can kind of boil down to, at least to some degree. I think about the Noahic covenant, which is what I would teach is the first covenant within the Bible. And we do already have a Noahic covenant video up if you're watching this real time. But the Noahic covenant is the promise that God will never flood the earth again in judgment, right? And so we have the rainbow, which is the sign. I think a lot of us are at least familiar with the Noahic covenant, even if you didn't know that's what it was called, or whatever. But it doesn't explicitly say I'm your God and you're my people, but the outworking of it is that he is God and he is protecting people, and Israel hasn't been established yet. We don't have the Abrahamic covenant until you flip the page. Generally speaking, it's chapter 9 and then chapter 12, so it's only a couple pages away. But you then do quickly have the Abrahamic covenant, which is the promise to Abraham that he will be a mighty nation and inherit the promised land, and in him all of the nations will be blessed or cursed, depending on the outworking of the covenant is somewhat conditional, but that covenant is unconditional. God's promise with Abraham for land and offspring and blessings is not wholeheartedly dependent on what he's going to do in response. It is dependent on God and what he has set out to do. I would say that the Abrahamic covenant is the first piece in the fulfillment of the curse from chapter 3, because it's through this promise that we have the chosen heir of Isaac and then Jacob, and you go through Jacob's genealogy until you hit David, and then you have the Davidic covenant, which is also a promised heir covenant. If you're watching this real time, there won't be a Davidic covenant video for some time, but if you're watching this in like a decade, there should be a Davidic covenant video up in this playlist. The Davidic covenant really emphasizes this promised heir, this promised future king, which will sort of hone in a little bit more on where Jesus is going to come from. So before it was just this promised seed, right? And that turns into Israel, and then through Israel it boils back down to being from this specific line, and from that specific line we make it to the line of the kings, and from the line of the kings will come the future promised king, which is Christ. The only covenant in here that we've skipped over is the Mosaic covenant, which is the law. Some people will argue that there is a sixth covenant, which is about the land, that aren't dispensational, but I disagree. I think it's part of the Mosaic covenant. And then finally, through the Davidic covenant, we reach the promised king, who ushers in the new covenant, or some people call it the covenant of grace. This is the New Testament. This is the cross, right? We look at covenant theology. We are often saying like these covenants are everlasting, the way that God is everlasting. And they don't always like fully apply in the sense that they are fulfilled, right? Like the Davidic covenant is fulfilled. So it doesn't still stand in the sense of like, we have Jesus. There's no need for like a future promised king. He is king. It's happened. Or like the Mosaic law has been fulfilled in Christ. Any of the covenants that no longer stand in that way are because they've been fulfilled in Christ. And only because they've been fulfilled in Christ do they no longer apply or still stand up. But that is to say that they don't like break up into different sections of the Bible. They come from an everlasting God, and they are everlasting covenants, and they are either continuing to be an everlasting covenant in the sense that like they still apply, like the Noahic covenant still applies, or they've been fulfilled and are still everlasting, but in the sense that they've been fulfilled, like the Davidic covenant. I have notes in my journal here that I'm going to read to you about dispensationalism. So dispensationalists would say that the covenants break up the Bible into, I think it's seven dispensations, rather than one big long promise for the king. And that is immediately where it kind of falls apart for me, because at what point do we think that the Bible isn't one big story? At what point do we think that the Bible isn't the story of God coming to redeem his people for his glory? At what point do we say, no, we've got this part of the Bible and then we've got this part of the Bible? It's not even based on like looping certain books together, because these will break up like Genesis into, 4 sections? And so it just doesn't add up to me, but I'm going to go over them anyway. So the 7 dispensations are innocence, which is Genesis 1:28 through 30, conscience, which is Genesis 3:8 through 8:22, human government, which is Genesis 8 through 11, promise, which is Genesis 12 through Exodus 19. Others have said through the 10 Commandments, which also doesn't make any sense. So I'm going to say Exodus 19. If we're going to go by this, then we're going to go by this, right? And then the law, which is Exodus 20 through to Christ's death. So depending on which gospel you're reading, right? And then we have the grace dispensation, which is from Christ's death through to the second coming. And then we have the millennial kingdom, which is Revelation 20 through to the end of the book, through Revelation 22. I don't see it, and I disagree. And I think another issue that tends to stem from this is when you are dispensational in this way, you view Israel in a different light than if you view the story as being one big narrative. And that is why I reject this. If the Bible is not one big narrative about God redeeming his people for his glory, but is instead about these different dispensations, we tend to focus really heavily on Israel and any promises that were made to them as if they were made to Israel and not to Israel because they're God's people, which then transfers to us. We are God's people. And I find it a little silly to ever think that, like, as Christians, we are not God's people, because that's what you imply when you say that Israel is still God's chosen people. That it doesn't stack up. And so I reject this theology, and this is the last time you will hear me talk about it. If you have any questions about theology around the different covenants and stuff, you can always put them in the comments down below. But there will be videos on each covenant as we reach them while we're reading through the Bible. If you are watching this after 2027, all of the covenant videos should be up by now, because we will have made it through Samuel at that point, and 2 Samuel is where the Davidic covenant is. So if it's before that, just hold your horses. We'll get there. Okay, I'll see you later. Bye.